Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thank you, and I hope you're well too.
Thank you.
This has been another, what should I say, a week that took our attention in a number of different ways, and I think that what we have to talk about is what the Prime Minister of New Zealand called New Zealand's darkest days, where some 49 people were shot
Hmm.
in two mosques in Christchurch, the main city on the South Island. Um, and it's very interesting. I mean, it's awful that this sort of thing continues to happen, but from a point of view of trying to understand what's going on in the world, it is also interesting that uh, well, it's been called civilizationalism.
Civilizationalism. Okay. How so?
The efforts to defend our civilization. And it's interesting that if one tries to relate this to other things that have happened, then there was the event in Norway
At that,
some
at that
7 or 8 years ago,
at
which
that
killed, I think,
at that summer camp.
70
Yeah.
people. There was the event in Pittsburgh.
Right. At the
And
synagogue.
of course, there's a whole string of events over the last decade or so. And they've all been, the perpetrators in each case have been white males. And I wouldn't normally draw attention to anything supposedly racial of that type. However, it is interesting that these things are not done by minorities,
Hmm.
and they're not done by women.
Hmm.
I can't think of any incident that's comparable to this, which was not what would normally in America be called a white male.
Hmm.
Um, so, and in this case, in the case of this man who was an Australian in New Zealand, he actually wrote about what he was doing and spent a long time preparing for it,
Hmm.
and chose the place for it very carefully. And his reason for choosing this place was that he thought it would demonstrate that even in a place like New Zealand, which is relatively, what shall I say, secluded from the rest of the world, since it's a relatively small territory, a long way away from everything else, even from Australia, would demonstrate to the world that nowhere is safe. And what he meant by safe means safe from immigration and what we're calling globalization,
Right.
being sucked into a global community. And I think we're going through a stage of world history in which there is resistance to this process. I would like to think it's a diminishing amount of resistance, and that we may have already passed through the main movement to resist globalization. But it's difficult to tell how long it's going to continue. Um, uh, but it's particularly interesting that it's the people who would be most obviously a part of what was the dominant global community up to 50 years ago, who seem to be the perpetrators in this resistance.
Well, that's a good observation, and I've sort of been thinking along the same lines. I think that I think the ship has sailed on globalization, and it's a funny thing. I just spent last week in London, and it's basically all Brexit all the time on the TV. And really, in any meeting you go to, people are checking their iPhones for the BBC applications. But meanwhile, in the morning, when you turn on BBC One in the background as you're preparing for the day, and glance up periodically, I noticed that probably 50 to 60% of the news commentators and news reporters are people of color, so to speak, who, if not immigrants themselves, and I suspect that they're not, they speak flawless British accent English, are certainly first or second or third generation immigrants. And they are obviously as part of the mainstream as could be, working on BBC Channel 1, interviewing members of parliament. I go to meetings over there, and there are numbers of people of color the same way as are on the television. And I suspect that what's happening is these are the final thrashings of a defeated kind of serpent, if you will, that has been beaten and recognizes that it's beaten, and is availing itself of the use of these ridiculous social media tools to try to grasp one last attempt at some sort of immortality and making themselves famous. That's how I read this, and that may be optimistic, but that's the way I see it.
Well, what keeps coming to my mind is that as I read about these things, and especially about what happened in New Zealand this past week, I see that every attempt to make sense of it focuses on the individual and the typology of individuals who do this sort of thing, and pays often no attention, but sometimes a little bit of attention, but not enough, to the fact that it's part of a social process. It's amazing how globalization is more of a social process than anything else. That is, it's the gradual inclusion of a larger and larger proportion of the world population into one community, that we still are relatively unaware of the importance in world history of the way people interact with each other. That is the social dimension of what's going on. We think in individualist terms and in cultural terms, and talk about one culture being a problem in relation to other cultures and that sort of thing. But we don't think of it in terms of what actually makes history work, which is people interacting with each other.
But there always were outliers, though, right? Throughout history, people who would throw their hands up and say, "I don't agree with the consensus of the group here, and I'm going to go off and live on the fringes of the group and maybe be a hermit." Now people have other options. If they're outliers and are dissatisfied, there are disaffected groups of similar-minded people that are easy to find through the tools of communication we have, and they can band together and they can prompt reactions such as we saw the other day.
There's they tend to think of these people as people who are, for psychological reasons, not fitting into society, rather than having psychological problems for social reasons, because of the way the group that they were interacting with and which they depended upon is being disrupted or being changed in a way that disturbs them. And I mean, this is something that I've been becoming more and more concerned about for a long time now, and I feel that so much of what we think of as psychology is really based on social problems, and the people who deal with psychology are not trained to understand the social problems.
Well, that could be. I think they're trained to understand the social problems within the small subset, perhaps, of a family unit or a small work environment, but certainly not on the kind of scale that we've been discussing, if you will, with globalization trends. It's really, it's really something because you see people who are unbelievably polarized. For example, in the United States over the current occupant of the White House, and in the UK over the Brexit vote. But polarization is one thing. Taking your marbles and toys and leaving the group and walking off and then exacting retribution against people who disagree with you is a completely different matter. And I think throughout history, and you would know better than I, but throughout history, I think the group, as it always changes and adds and decreases, the group will defend itself against people like that and act to ostracize them and to make sure that they can't harm the overall decisions of the group as a whole. And what we're seeing now, unfortunately, is because people can get access to very lethal weapons and create great damage and carnage and lash out against groups, in this case Muslims, or in the case of Pittsburgh, Jews, lash out against people that they view as being responsible for the change that disaffected them from the group, and then also, as an added byproduct, attain some degree of fame through a YouTube channel or the internet. It's confused the situation, but it hasn't changed the basics. These are still the people who are living one day away from the pack as the pack nomadically moves from oasis to oasis. I mean, they're out there on the hinterlands and they're not around the campfire at night, but that's by their own choice.
Yes, but I think from a social perspective, one can say that anti-Islamism has taken the place in the 21st century of what was called anti-Semitism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Even though we keep reading about anti-Semitism again now.
Yes.
For reasons that I don't fully understand. But the main problem is people who don't who have a different idea of the way society should work in relation to them. Mm-hmm. Seems to cause trouble still, even in a much larger community that is becoming a global community than the communities that were the context of earlier forms of discrimination.
They do, and part of that I think is as I say, because of the availability of weapons and then the notoriety that's instantly obtained through the social media. But I would venture to say that despite the notoriety that these people achieve, there are fewer and fewer of them in the aggregate. When you look at the number of people that are saying, okay, well, these are the decisions that have been made. We're going along with it. We may not be very happy with it. We may not even be happy with it, but we're not going to go buy assault weapons and start killing people.
Well, that's what I think we need to mention before we finish, is the fact that in the first half of the 20th century, the reaction to anything like this was not to shoot people.
Yes.
Now it's mass shooting, and that again, I think, has something to do with the way that attitudes towards life mm-hmm. have changed under globalization, under the in this process of where everybody's interacting with larger and larger numbers of people. Everything that has to do with social relationships and the way we think about social relationships is now different from what it used to be.
Attitudes towards life, you mean a cheapening view of it, a lessening?
Well, life and death. I mean, now, for example, 50 years ago, it was a sin to kill yourself. Now it's up. If you decide that it's time to end your life, that's a perfectly reasonable decision to make.
Yeah. Well, let's hope neither of us do that before our next show next week. Although I'll tell you that the news from New Zealand is terrible. My heart goes
Yeah.
out to them. So
Well, let's hope the spring equinox will bring better things. I'll see you after the spring equinox.
Happy New Year in Persian. All right. Thank you very much, Brian.
Bye.
Bye.